Have you ever wondered, why do felons lose all their rights? This is Christina Williams with Just Criminal Law.
And David Mann, legal storytelling specialist. Yes, actually, I have wondered that. We sort of know generally that felons, someone convicted of a felony loses their rights, but which rights and why is that? So maybe tell us first, what's one of the first rights that they lose?
Sure, they lose rights like the right to own or possess a firearm, the right to hold public office, the right to vote. Those are just to name a few. And a lot of times, they're able, it varies from state to state, but a lot of times they're able to get those rights back eventually if they go through the process.
Okay, so first on the gun ownership, I'm sure many people are, curious about that. Specifically, what is restricted when this right is taken away?
Well, the purpose of restricting it, if you dig deep, it's because the system doesn't want the felon to be a threat to community safety. So the assumption is, if you're a felon, you may be involved in more criminal activity, or, you may be more inclined to use a gun. So the thought was, we'll just take that right away. But it really doesn't make sense, say, if somebody has a felony DUI, there's really, the crime didn't involve guns, it didn't involve violence, and so, but it's just a blanket restriction, and it doesn't necessarily make sense. And you see a lot of states now that are backing away from that if it's not a violent felony.
So if someone gets convicted of a felony and they already have, 7 guns because they're really into hunting, what happens to, do they get taken away or what happens with that?
They have to remove the guns from their residence. They can't have them with them in their car. They already, they already own them. So, they can have someone else hold them for them. They certainly can't purchase any more firearms. A lot of times people give away their guns to family members or they sell their guns. But the idea, during their probation is they definitely can't possess a firearm because they have a probation officer that's coming to their residence to check on them. And if they were in possession of a gun, that could be a safety concern for that probation officer. So during that period, even if they're not convicted of a violent felony and they're maybe able to get their gun rights back after they're done with their sentence, they at least cannot possess them, and they certainly can't buy anymore.
Okay. All right. So if they're caught with one, that's a parole violation, or just do they get thrown in jail at that point?
Yes, that would be considered, depending on where they are in their process. Say they didn't go to prison, then they're just on probation. Yes, that could definitely be a probation violation. And if they've gone to prison and now they're on parole and they possess a firearm, again, that could be a parole violation. Because they're being supervised by these agents, it's something that a judge would take very seriously because they want to protect these agents that are supervising the offender.
So that is the gun ownership right being taken away. That's a really huge, very tangible, very immediate thing. It's core to people's identity and things. So it's a huge one to lose. Another one that you mentioned was voting. So a felon is not allowed to vote. So why is that?
Well, the general idea is that the person is not someone that necessarily is encouraged to then participate in that civil process. The idea is that they don't follow the rules, they don't follow the law, and this should be part of the punishment, is that they can't participate in that process. Now, again, that varies from state to state, and it is possible to get those rights back. You do have to go through a process in order to do that, but it's deep in the history of our rules and why they exist. It's just because the system has deemed them as really, their opinion shouldn't count. I don't know that I agree with that, but that is a consequence.
Okay, and that doesn't look like it's going to be changing. What about jury duty? Are they able to serve on a jury when they're a felon?
No, they're not. They're not able to serve on a jury, and a lot of times that jury selection process that occurs where the attorneys pick the jury, they get to strike certain members, and if you have a convicted felon in the panel, the state has to use one of their strikes. We only get so many. The defense gets so many strikes, and the state gets so many strikes. And so they, more than likely, you're going to have the prosecutor using one of their strikes to get a felon off of the panel. And, is that fair? The defense attorney is not necessarily going to strike them, but the prosecutor is more than likely always going to strike them. And so just that process, it's a technical explanation, but just that process eliminates the state from having to strike the person from the jury. And, if they've gone through the process of being a felon, they're probably, not really all that much of a fan of the system, and they might bring too much to the table to weigh in as a juror in determining the guilt or innocence of that particular person.
So there is some logic behind these rules, even if they don't necessarily apply to all situations. What about holding office then? So I know I think you mentioned one of the rights that's taken away. Once you commit a felony, you're not allowed to hold office, but it sounds to me like maybe that's not across the board. There might be some variability to that. Is that true?
That's true. And again, some of this it changes state to state, but for the most part, you lose your right to hold public office. And, the idea being that if you're elected, you've been put in this position of power and authority and trust. And, the idea is just a generalized idea. It's that, if you're a convicted felon, perhaps you shouldn't have all of that power and authority. And so, excuse me, when it comes to, city and state elections, then that may vary a bit, but that's kind of the idea behind it.
Okay, so I think something on a lot of people's mind when we think of this is the newly inaugurated president right now has all of these felony counts. And so it seems like that's definitely a public office. How is that possible to happen?
Well, as far as whether or not you can run for president, that's all laid out in the Constitution. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says if you're a convicted felon, you cannot run for president. There's a laundry list of things. You have to be a certain age. You have to be a citizen. There are requirements, but one of those requirements does not require that you be free of a felony.
So that may be because it was never foreseen that would happen. But we have that situation now, and there must have been some kind of process. There's running for office, and then there is serving in the office. Is there a distinction there regarding the felony?
No distinction. And again, this varies from state to state, and certainly the state law doesn't determine who runs for president or who would serve as president. That's up to the electorate. But there's really no distinction when it comes to city or state. elected officials as to whether you can run or whether you can serve.
So if someone has a felony on their record, they will, lose these rights. But you've been saying that they can get reinstated. So how difficult is that to get to happen?
You can, there's a couple of different ways that you can do it. You can, get your record expunged and your rights restored. That's where you go to court again. And a lot of times you have an attorney help you, and you petition the court to expunge your record. And depending on where that happens, the court can expunge that record, sometimes seal that record, and the court can restore all of those rights that you lost if you're able to show that you have rehabilitated yourself, that you've conformed your conduct to the law, you haven't gotten in any more trouble. But there's usually a time period that has to pass in order to do that. And then there is the process of getting a pardon. So you can have the governor of your state pardon your record. Now that doesn't mean that it removes the conviction, but it is persuasive, as far as showing that you've rehabilitated yourself. So you can receive a pardon. It's not as good per se as receiving an expungement and sealing your record. Or you can also receive a presidential pardon. And, the pardons not only cover any convictions, but it also can cover any criminal conduct in order to preclude you from being prosecuted. So the pardons can be more than just the conviction. It can actually pardon the conduct that could potentially be prosecuted.
Well, like most of these topics, there seems to be so much more to this. If someone wants to find out more about felony convictions relative to rights, or wants to contact you for criminal defense, how might they do either one of those things?
Sure. We'll include a link to our blog post in the description where you can get a little more information or explore these topics in more detail. Or you can always call, text, or chat with a member of our team anytime, day or night. Here at Just Criminal Law, we know you only get one shot at justice, so make yours count.